Arthur Blank actually did it. He fired both Raheem and Terry, so perhaps the future is bright in Atlanta.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, now the number one sports podcast network in the galaxy because it's number one on the planet, which means it's number one in the solar system. Today's Locked On Falcons is sponsored by Prize Picks. Download the Prize Picks app today. Use code Locked On NFL and you'll get $50 in lineups after you play your first $5 lineup. If you don't know me, I'm your humble host, Aaron Freeman. Been covering the Falcons for almost 2 decades, formerly at FalcFans.com, RIP, still going strong as the humble host of the illustrious Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. In today's episode, we will be talking all about the breaking news. Less than 5 hours after the Falcons' Week 18 win over the New Orleans Saints, that Raheem Morris and Terry Fontenot are out as head coach and general manager of this team. We'll talk about how we got here, what's next for this team, where does Matt Ryan figure into this, who are some of the top candidates for both of these roles that we will have to keep our eyes on in the coming weeks and over the next month or so as this process unfolds. But Terry and Raheem are gone, and of course the question is, how did we get here, right? And it's essentially the reason why we got here is when Raheem Morris was hired in 2024, obviously Terry Fontenot was hired in 2021. The expectations for Raheem going into that 2024 season that he was supposed to win. The expectations were that Terry Fontenot, in his 3 years as the general manager here in Atlanta up to that point, had built a playoff caliber roster. That the shortcomings of that 2023 Falcon team stemmed from the head coach in Arthur Smith and stemmed from the quarterback in Desmond Ridder. And that the Falcons could figure that, and they deemed Raheem Morris to be that coach, and they then subsequently deemed Kirk Cousins to be that quarterback that would get them over the hump to being the playoff team. And it didn't work with Kirk Cousins. And obviously the Falcons also selected Michael Penix with that top 2024 draft pick. And they basically were like, well, okay, it didn't work with Kirk Cousins in 2024. Well, it's going to work in 2025 with Michael Penix. And it didn't work. And that's really those two bets. That's all the Falcons really needed to get over the hump, was that bet on those quarterbacks was really the bet that kind of blew up in Raheem Morris and Terry Fontenot's faces. That, as you've heard me say many, many, many times on this podcast over the years, over the months, over the weeks, this team was far too complacent about how good a football roster they had already built, and far too complacent about how far they needed to go in order to get over that hump, to go from the perennial 7-win team that they were under Arthur Smith and previous coaches. And all Raheem Morris and the quarterbacks did were add one more win to those totals with 2 8-9 finishes. And that clearly was not good enough for ownership. It wasn't good enough for this fan base, and that's how we got here. And the hope is that this firing, because the rumors over the last 48 hours had been that Raheem was going to stay and Terry was going to go and all that sort of stuff. And it just felt like it was a half measure. It felt like, once again, the Falcons were going to be complacent, believing that, hey, because they played really well in some primetime games in front of, national TV audience, that, the perception of this team was once again going to be, hey, we just got to tweak a couple of things and we'll be right there. And hopefully this move now means that the Falcons are not going to be in that mindset, or not going to be in that complacent mindset, and they're actually going to do the work to become a better football team, as opposed to just believing that they can take shortcuts, which is what they've been trying to do for the better part of a decade. Right? They'll get new people in the building. Those new people will not be beholden to this roster, right? That was never going to be the case with Terry Fontenot. Terry Fontenot was going to believe my roster is great. We have conviction, all the stuff that Terry Fontenot spews. And they were just going to basically run it back with basically the same team. They were going to have the ultimate faith in their roster, in the roster they already built. It was already good enough. We just need to tweak it. We just need to adjust it. And, I think more than anything, that not only obviously had an impact on Terry Fontenot's status, right? But I think that was probably the biggest reason for the downfall of Raheem Morris. is that he had far too much confidence in the roster, in the middling roster that ultimately it proved to be over and over and over and over again, 5 times in a row. The middling roster that Terry Fontenot had. And if Raheem had come in here and been a little bit more aggressive with being like, yeah, Terry, you've gotten us 40% up the mountain. We got to get the other 60% up, as opposed to what they essentially did, which is like, oh, we're already like 80% up the mountain. We just got to get the last 20%, right? If Raheem come in there with that type of mentality, I think this team, and been a lot more aggressive with some of the moves that they made over the last 2 off seasons, particularly in free agency, maybe a little less aggressive in the draft, but, have been a lot more aggressive with that and getting immediate contributors in free agency. I think this team probably would have found success under Raheem Morris. I really do believe that. But obviously they did not do that. And, you couple that mistake with the fact that the on-field product just wasn't very good under Raheem Morris, right? We talked about this throughout the season, like when talking about Raheem Morris's job status, where it's like, if you're going to run it back with Raheem, why? What is it that Raheem is bringing to the table as a head coach that you're like, sign me up for more of that, right? The main thing with Raheem, because he's not really calling plays on offense or defense, is his clock management, right? His in-game management. Subpar, simply put, right? You're not talking about a team that plays up to their potential every single week, right? If this was a Dan Campbell-led Lions team that we saw, you go back to that first year under Dan Campbell, where that team was one of the worst rosters in the NFL, but were consistently competitive each and every week, we'd be having a different conversation. But this team played up to their competition and also played down to their competition, and you never knew which version of the Atlanta Falcons you were going to get. And then it's like the other aspect of being a head coach is hiring good coordinators. And Raheem didn't hire good coordinators, right? You give the Jeff Ulbrich hire, the redo of the defensive coordinator hire that he had after the failure of Jimmy Lake in year 1 in 2024. You do the redo of that DC hire with Jeff Ulbrich in 2025, and you get that A+. But that's 1 out of 4 coordinator hires that Raheem Morris had made. Successful ones, right? Ulbrich was a successful one. Zach Robinson didn't live up to the hype. Jimmy Lake certainly didn't live up to the hype. That's why he got fired. And Marquise Williams didn't live up to the hype, right? That's not a good, hit rate, 1 of 4. And even if you did give him a do-over to redo the offensive coordinator hire and the special teams hire this offseason, and by keeping him, even if he hit on both of those, you still have a 3 for 6, right? A 50-50 proposition when it comes to coordinators. Like, how many swings are you going to get with that? Even if it gets over the hump, and then, if it does get you over the hump, then, those guys are going to leave, and then you got to hire new coordinators, and, how many swings are you going to get? So ultimately, I think the Falcons made the right decision, right? It felt like the Falcons under Raheem Morris were destined for another disappointing 7 or 8 win season. Maybe their ceiling was 9, maybe 10 wins if everything went their way next year. But there was really no path for this team to get significantly better with the current decision makers here because of a lot of the poor decisions made by Terry Fontenot, because of not having the draft capital, of not having any cap space, right? We talked about this on previous episode, but we talked about this this time last year. Everybody wanted Terry Fontenot gone, and I sat here on this podcast and said, I want to see if Terry can dig himself out of the hole. And Terry's solution to digging himself out of the hole was digging even deeper, right? By giving the team less draft capital, by giving the team less cap space, all for this notion of, hey, if we just get the pass rushers in here, it'll solve our problems. And sure, we solved the pass rush, but it didn't solve the rest of the team problems because there were other issues. That's the issue. This team constantly misdiagnoses its problems. They don't self-evaluate. They look at their team and they say, we only have 1 problem to solve when they have 5 problems to solve. And that was not going to change by running it back with either Terry Fontenot or Raheem Morris this offseason. And that needs to change, essentially, until this team can look at themselves honestly in the mirror and realize, yes, we have 4 or 5 things that we need to address, as opposed to constantly convincing themselves that they only have 1 or 2. Things were not going to get better. So I think the Falcons made the right move. We'll see how much pressure there is to win, right? Is Arthur Blank going to have a mandate to the next coaching staff, similar to what we heard with Raheem Morris, which was, essentially you got to win with the roster that you're going to inherit, or is he going to give the next regime more leeway to not necessarily tear it down, but to redo it, to remodel this house, so to speak. And so we'll talk more about what's next for this football team. We'll talk about what Matt Ryan potentially could figure into this remodeling as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. So kicking off the new year can feel good as a goal, right? Now, honestly, hydration is the easiest way to win when you're, setting up positive goals, right? If you stay on top of your hydration, it can boost your energy, your focus, and your mood will all level up. And if you're looking to level up your hydration, try our sponsor today, Drip Drop, a doctor-developed, proven fast hydration system that helps your body and mind work better. It uses precise ratio of electrolytes and glucose for rapid absorption, delivering 3 times the electrolytes and half the sugar of leading sports drinks. It tastes amazing, right? There's 16 original flavors, 8 zero sugar options. This Christmas season, I had a couple of relatives that, got a little too buck wild on Christmas Eve, and we're feeling it the following day, and, hooked them up with some passion fruit, some watermelon, some lime, with Drip Drop the following day, and they were right by Christmas evening, right? So check it out by going to Drip Drop, and they're offering our listeners 20% off their first order by going to dripdrop.com and use promo code LOCKEDONNFL. That's dripdrop.com, promo code LOCKEDONNFL for 20% off. Stock up now at dripdrop.com and use promo code LOCKEDONNFL. Today's episode is also brought to you by PrizePicks. Whether you're starting a new routine or jumping into player projections for the first time, trying something new can feel daunting and like a challenge. But with PrizePicks, it's easy, right? It's also good to be right? There's high-pressure football matchups every weekend, elite hoops action almost every night, and the action never slows down. PrizePicks is going to keep you in control of that action because they're a daily fantasy app that lets you build lineups based off of player stat projections. No drafts, no waiting, just pick more or less. Play your way. You can play so many different ways with a huge range of unique stat options, yards, fantasy score, 3-pointers, whatever fits your strategy. Download the PrizePicks app today. Use code LOCKEDONNFL, and you'll get $50 in lineups after you play your first $5 lineup. That's code LOCKEDONNFL for $50 in lineups after your first $5 play. PrizePicks, it is good to be right. So level up your everydayerness. And shout out to all of you everydayers that make Locked On Falcons your first listen. You are the reason why Locked On is now the #1 sports podcast network in the galaxy. But you can level up your everydayerness by joining the Everydayer Club. Get an ad-free version of Locked On Falcons, exclusive Locked On Podcast Network Discord channel, Locked On Podcast Network merch. You can find other perks by going to the link in the description below at lockedonfalcons.supercast.com. $5 a month, $50 a year to find those perks as part of the Everydayer Club. So obviously what's next? The Falcons have 2 vacancies at head coach, general manager. But really, the big question that's going to hang over this team, obviously not for the next couple of weeks, the big question is going to be who's going to be the new head coach, who's going to be the new general. But really the big question that's going to hang over this team for the next calendar year is what is the future at quarterback, right? And speaking of quarterback, right, we heard the rumors last week about Matt Ryan potentially taking a role, an undefined, undisclosed, undetermined role, but significant role in the Falcons front office. And you guys heard me being very dismissive of that, being very skeptical of that last week, mostly because, I don't really think former player, having Matt Ryan make football decisions doesn't make a lot of sense. But in the time since then, some of you guys have been letting me know about, Chris Spielman and what he does for the Detroit Lions. And I'll admit I did not know enough about that. And doing some research, that's what I imagine Matt Ryan's role is going to be, which is, I think Spielman's official title is like special assistant to the CEO and owner. And, Chris Spielman doesn't really make football decisions. He's more of a culture guy. And we'll see if that's the case for Matt Ryan, if he's going to help fix the Falcons culture. Culture is always a weird, nebulous term because it's like when teams are successful, it's like, oh, they have a good culture. And when they're unsuccessful, they have a terrible culture. And it's like, but what exactly is the culture thing? So, I tend to always be a little skeptical when people talk about culture. But, what Spielman probably did more than anything was he was in the room and, allegedly, again, I don't know all the details because I wasn't there, but allegedly was a big part of why the Lions wound up hiring Dan Campbell and Brad Holmes back in 2021. And hopefully Matt Ryan will have a similar influence of hiring, helping Arthur Blank make the decision to hire a good head coach and a good GM at this point in time, right? And I think if Matt Ryan, regardless of the culture thing, if he can help this team do, again, what I said earlier, which is do an honest look in the mirror, I think they have a chance to be successful, or this next regime will have a chance to be successful, because this constant sort of piecemeal one approach away, and you've heard me refer to it as the Super Bowl 51 mentality, which is where the Falcons have basically defined the last decade of this team's history, which stems from that Super Bowl loss that we all want to forget, is the notion that, we're so close. And if we just tweak this, if we adjust this, we would have won the Super Bowl. And that's been the Falcons' mentality and approach every seemingly season since then, pretty much, with few exceptions over the last 9 years, which is like, if we just tweak this. And it's like, to me, this is the heart of why this team has gone now what is the second longest playoff drought definitively, because Carolina Panthers just snapped there. They were tied with the Panthers for 8-year playoff drought, the second longest behind the Jets of 12 or 13 years, whatever it is now. And now it's definitively the second longest active playoff drought, because the Panthers, thanks to the Atlanta Falcons, are going to the playoffs. But, I think Ryan and company will help this team hire some people with honest eyes and realize, rather than they're just like, we're this close. So it's like, we're not far. Like, this team is not like at the bottom of the league, but like they're a couple of years away. They got a lot of changes that they need to make and a lot of improvements they need to make, rather than just believing, hey man, we just got to tweak 2 spots and we're good to go. Right. And the big question is going to be the quarterback, right? Because until they get that situation solved, stabilized, there's no real path for this team to be a consistently good team in the future. Michael Penix is obviously coming off an injury. Kirk Cousins, you can win with Kirk Cousins, right? He's 12-10 as a starter here in Atlanta over the last 2 years. That basically averages out to be about a 9-8 quarterback over a 17-game season. The question is going to be, is ownership going to, again, mandate you win now? And that's going to pressure whoever takes over to either retain Kirk Cousins or bring in someone else who can also stabilize that position until Michael Penix comes back. If Michael Penix comes back, all those various questions. But, for the last 2 months since Penix had his injury, we've basically not fully closed the door, Michael Penix, but the door is barely cracked at this point in time, mostly because there isn't a lot of optimism, for me at least. I know other people's mileage varies, but that Penix is going to be that stabilizing force. He's going to come off of this injury with no offseason, come back and play however many games. He's going to play in a brand new offense and hit the ground running in a brand new offense with no offseason, and get this team back to where it wants to go in 2026, where you're comfortable going with Michael Penix as your starter in 2027. And so your best avenue for finding that quarterback is finding that quarterback in the 2027 draft when you have a first-round pick again. Right. And that's why, to me, going into 2026 with Raheem Morris, having this sort of all-in mentality, was not in this team's best long-term interest, because, in my opinion, it's in this team's best long-term interest to land a quarterback in 2027. That's really it. And it's not to say that's the only problem this team faces, but it's the biggest question, right? Can you find a quarterback? And, it comes across as tanking. I'm usually the anti-tanking guy on this show, right? I'm usually anti-tanking, but to me, it was just kind of in this team's best interest to kind of bottom out, get a top 5 pick, and hopefully you land a big fish in the 2027 draft, which is allegedly, we'll see. Again, nothing is guaranteed, but allegedly is going to be a deep quarterback class, right? So we'll see. I think if you not necessarily tank or, but if you're not really pushing to go all in and you're willing to take a reset this year, you'll be able to recoup draft picks in 2027. You'll be able to recoup a ton of cap space so that you can fill out some of the needs that this team needs to fill out, as opposed to going into 2026 being like, we only have 1 or 2 needs and we don't have to worry about these other positions. You're going to have an opportunity to address whatever those top few needs are in 2026 this offseason, but really you're going to make most of your improvements in 2027 when you have a ton of cap space and hopefully a ton of draft picks, because you're letting a bunch of free agents like Kyle Pitts, like Caden Ellis, among others, walk this offseason, Tyler Algier, and getting some compensatory picks in 2027. But that's not a guaranteed strategy for success, but I think it's probably your best path rather than trying to, again, piecemeal it together. But to me, as I've stated before in the podcast, you gotta give the next regime an opportunity to get a young quarterback, if that's the path they're going to go, and work out those kinks early on in their regime. I think a big part of the downfall of both Arthur Smith and Raheem Morris is that they had their quote-unquote all-in years. That was 2023 for Arthur Smith. That was this past year for Raheem Morris with a first-year starting quarterback. And both of those guys went through Desmond Ridder in 23, Michael Penix in 25, went through the typical struggles that a first-year starting quarterback goes through. And you can't have this where it's all in. You can't go into 2028 with a first-year starting quarterback. You can't wait, right? So if you get your quarterback in 2027, you can go through all the growing pains, start that guy week 1, 2027, go through all your growing pains in 2027 with that guy, and then hopefully you work out all the kinks, and then hopefully you get a big year 2 jump in 2028 from that young quarterback. And that's when you can really make that push forward after the investments that you've continually made. You'll still have, the 25 class on their rookie deals. Hopefully they will be at their peaks. Jalen Walker, James Pierce, the peak versions of those guys. And that 2028 team is going to be a legit good team now that you've figured out the quarterback position. But that to me is the best timeline for the Falcons. We'll see if this ownership is patient enough to follow that timeline, because it may require the team not being particularly good in 2026. We'll sort of see on that. But I think that's the best path forward for the Falcons. That's my 2 cents. Obviously, I'm not making the decisions, but one hopes that there's an intern, there's somebody in that building in Flowery Branch that is, an everydayer of this podcast that has been like, Aaron Freeman, he might be on to something. Just run it up the food chain. That's all I'm asking. Just run it up the food chain is all I'm asking. So we'll see if the Falcons can figure out the quarterback position. That's really, again, going to be the big topic. I promise you, we will talk about all the other subsequent issues, right? But it's going to be quarterback, head coach, GM. Or obviously 2 of those solutions is not in the building. One of those could be in the building with Michael Penix. Maybe long term, we'll see. But I think there's reasons for everybody involved to be skeptical of that, given what we've seen from Michael Penix, given this injury, and the fact that you just can't really have that much confidence moving forward that even if Penix does come back strong next year, he could easily get injured again the following year. There's like a 62% chance, based off of that he's going to get hurt again, based off his history. So whatever the math is. So it's just hard to really put it all on Michael Penix. But all that to say, now the conversation, now that the vacancies are there, everybody's wondering who's going to fill those spots, right? And so let's talk about some of the top GM candidates. Let's talk about some of the top head coaching candidates to wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. This episode is sponsored by BetterHelp. The new year doesn't require a new you, maybe just a less burden you. We all carry things that weigh us down or hold us back, and therapy can help you identify what those things are by offering an unbiased perspective to better understand your relationships, motivations, and emotions. That's where BetterHelp comes in, making it easy to get matched online with a qualified therapist who can help you work through whatever is holding you back. BetterHelp makes it easy to get matched with a licensed therapist. I know when I joined BetterHelp many years ago, one of the things I wanted was a person of color, and I was able to get that. And the beautiful thing about BetterHelp is if you don't find the right fit, the right match, you can switch anytime, basically for free. So BetterHelp is going to make it easy for you to get matched online with a qualified therapist. Sign up and get 10% off at betterhelp.com/lockedon. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/lockedon. Today's episode is also brought to you by Game Time. There's nothing like being at the game, whether it's the crowd noise, the energy, cheering alongside the other fans. It just hits different. But it can be hard to get those tickets, because you got to worry about queues and logins and prices changing at checkout. And Game Time is the app that is going to make it easy. They're going to take the guesswork out of it and give you the advantage back to the fans. What we love about Game Time is what you see is what you get. The price you see on the app is the price you pay, because you don't have to worry about hidden fees at checkout. The panoramic seat views allow you to know what your event's going to look like before you buy. So if you want to take the guesswork out of buying upcoming playoff tickets, not for the Falcons, college football, Peach Bowl coming up next week, go check it out at Game Time by downloading the Game Time app, create an account, use code LOCKEDONNFL. That's LOCKEDON for 20 ONNFL. LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off. Download the Game Time app today and get back to being there live. So, GM-wise, the Falcons are almost certainly going to hire a first-time GM. That's just the nature of the beast. You know, I know someone, shout out to AJ Evans, was in the chat after the Week 18 finale and the rapid reaction being, you know, I forgot exactly how he termed it, but he was like, what established GM are we going to hire? And it's like, there are no established GMs. If you're a GM in the NFL, you get one shot. There's a reason why Thomas Dimitroff has not gotten a second shot. It's very rare. It happens on occasion, but it's very rare for a GM to get multiple opportunities in the GM shot. It's going to be a first-time GM in all likelihood. And so that's just how it goes. You don't get retreads in this league. So, you know, for the names that I constantly hear, I don't necessarily have a horse in the race. Ian Cunningham, who's the assistant GM for the Bears, Ed Dodds for the Colts, James Lipford for the Texans. I've heard that name, Alec Hallaby for the Eagles. Cunningham's interesting, not because of anything he's done in the Bears in the last 4 years, but just because he comes from both the Ravens and the Eagles. So he's worked under people like Ozzie Newsome and Howie Roseman. And so that you know, that's a nice boost to your resume where you're, you know, and especially for me, someone who is anti-Terry Fontenot in terms of trading up and wants someone to do the comp picks and trade back and accumulate assets, you know, someone from the Ravens, you know, sounds pretty good to my ears at this point in time. So Ian Cunningham is intriguing for that reason. Now, when it comes to the coaches, you know, and same conversation with the GM, ultimately, it's going to be interesting to see who's in the room that's, you know, influencing Arthur Blank, right? We're assuming if Matt Ryan gets whatever the job he's going to get, he'll be in that room. Greg Beatles is the team president. He'll be in that room. Is Rich McKay going to be in the room? You know, is the Falcons consulting forum, Sportsology, going to be in the room guiding Arthur Blank? So that's going to be fascinating. We'll certainly have more information, you know, in the next couple of days and weeks than we do right now when it comes to that. But that's going to obviously have some influence on, you know, potential candidates for both GM and head coach, how they influence things. But when you look at some of the top head coaching candidates, you know, offensive-minded guys, Klint Kubiak, Seahawks OC, probably is going to be one of the top candidates. Kevin Stefanski, the Browns head coach, is going to be one of the top candidates. Todd Monken, the Ravens OC, Mike McCarthy, you know, Joe Brady, the Bills offensive coordinator. These are some of the guys that are going to be some of the more offensive-minded head coach that probably will get a lot of interviews this cycle. Defensively, Jesse Minter, the Chargers defensive coordinator, Brian Flores, the Vikings defensive coordinator, Lou Anarumo, the Colts defensive coordinator, Anthony Weaver, the Dolphins defensive coordinator. These are probably some of the candidates. There are others, you know, Chris Shula, the Rams DC, but I don't know if the Falcons going to double dip in the Rams DC hires in back-to-back. You know, Robert Saleh, we'll see. I don't know if the Falcons going to go down that road. You might as well just hire Jeff Ulbrich if that's what you're going to go, but that's just my personal opinion. You know, typically we see teams do the opposite of what they did the last time. You know, since Raheem is a defensive-minded CEO type head coach, that probably means like a offensive-minded head coach this cycle, but we'll see. You know, do they go for a first-time OC, or do they want someone who is a little bit more established? Again, a lot of that's going to have to do with ownership, and is there pressure to win? Does he want a Mike McCarthy? Does he want a Kevin Stefanski that's been there, done that, that's had some success, right? Mike McCarthy has a Super Bowl ring, right? Does Arthur Blank, you know, being like, hey, they talked me out of Bill Belichick. I want to run it back with Bill Belichick. We'll see. I'm skeptical of that, but, you know, it's the Falcons. So we'll see on that front. But, you know, or does some defense, up-and-coming defensive hotshot wow them in the interview, right? We'll see. You know, my 2 cents, I don't always have a horse in this race. I know people are surprised when I say stuff like that. It's like, how can you not have a favorite candidate? Because I learned a long time ago, guys, that, you know, I don't have any clue who's going to be a good head coach, especially when it comes to guessing which hot up-and-coming coordinator is going to be a great head coach. You know, you can tell who's a good coordinator, who can call plays, and that's something. That means something, but it isn't necessarily guaranteeing you look at Dan Campbell. right? Dan Campbell wasn't a play caller, right? And he's proven twice now that he's a competent play caller when forced to do the job, but like that wasn't what he was known for when he's been one of the better coaches in the NFL over the last 5 years. So, always stuff like that. But, I do believe in general that if you hit on an offensive-minded head coach, that's going to give you a lot more stability than any other alternative option. And you heard me on the most recent Week 18 Rapid Reaction talk about, Terry Fontenot and Mickey Loomis and the Saints, and talking about the stability that having Sean Payton and Drew Brees had for those teams for 15 years, right? And essentially that combination is the best combination. It really is, right? Now, whether the Falcons have Drew Brees or not remains to be seen, but at least in theory, they can, go out there and get their Sean Payton during this cycle. But it's easier said than done, right? The talent pool when it comes to offensive-minded head coaches pretty shallow, right? It's been mined to death, so to speak, over the years, right? Everybody's been searching for the next Kyle Shanahan, the next Sean McVay for the last 9 years now at this point. And so there's been a lot of guys that have gotten those opportunities, and a lot of those guys have failed. So we'll see if the Falcons try that way. But I do generally believe that. But that doesn't mean you have to go out there and hire an offensive-minded coach. I think you can hire somebody else. So we'll see on that front. So obviously, as we go through these candidates, as we did last time in 2024, we will talk about each one and talk about their resumes and what they're bringing to the table and why you would like them. Obviously, I say that, just because like you look at Mike McDonald and his success in Seattle, right? And so like, if you can find the next Mike McDonald. But clearly, basically, the last thing I'll say is this. When you look around the rest of the NFL, with Dan Campbell probably being one of the most prominent examples, if you look at the most successful coaches that have been hired over the last 5 to 7 years around the NFL, it's almost always really high-level coordinators, right? So if you want to see real change for the Falcons, it is hiring either a defensive guru like a Mike McDaniel or an offensive guru, Sean McVay, obviously Kyle Shanahan, but just look at the Bears and Ben Johnson, that sort of thing. That seems to be the best path to doing so. And so we'll see if the Falcons try to follow that blueprint. They tried it once before with Arthur Smith. It didn't work out. But to a lesser extent, you could say that with Raheem Morris, although I don't know if people were like, oh, Raheem Morris is a defense genius. It's like, oh, but he's a Super Bowl winning defensive coordinator. But we'll see if the Falcons go down that path. But obviously, we'll keep it covered. I don't expect the Falcons to make a hire anytime soon. I expect because of this cycle, you're going to hear a lot of people get interviewed. It's going to be a long cycle, and probably the last week of January, as I'm making my way down to the Senior Bowl, is potentially when the Falcons may hire a guy. Maybe that weekend before. I think that was pretty much the case with Raheem Morris last time. So we'll see on that front. So guys, that's going to do it for us. That's my initial thoughts on this. Obviously, we'll be continuing to unpack this. Appreciate you guys for hanging out with me. I know you have a lot of unanswered questions. We'll do our best to try to get to those questions. So if you want to hit me up, leave a comment here on YouTube. Hit me up on LockedOnFalcons@mail.com. If you're a Locked On Falcons insider, you can join at the link in the description. You will get priority on those upcoming questions by joining that at joinsubtext.com/LockedOnFalcons. 14-day free trial. So, you can get your question boosted without having to pay a dime by becoming a Locked On Falcons insider for the next 2 weeks. So that's going to do it for us, guys. Appreciate you. Check out Locked On NFL to get all the scoop on all the fallout, because I'm sure many of you are listening to this on Monday, there have been other firings. Just the Falcons were the first. And so, kudos to you, Atlanta. Not waiting around. So that's going to do it for us, guys. Appreciate you. We'll be back with more. It's all part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.